Thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Ellie Martin, and I'm here to tell you a little bit about the research I conducted for my capstone project for the Masters of Liberal Arts here at Johns Hopkins University. So, for my capstone, I decided to look into the philosophy of education of President Charles William Eliot. And he was president of Harvard for 40 years, an astonishing 40-year term, beginning when he was just 35 in 1869, and he retired at the age of 75 in 1909. Eliot is remembered for a lot of things over those 40 years, but probably the thing he is most famous for was his introduction of the elective system across American higher education. So prior to Eliot's reforms, American higher education looked pretty much the same across the board. Every student was required to take what was called a prescribed curriculum. It wasn't the same at every school, of course, but each school required the same curriculum in that school that all students were required to take. So there were no opportunities for student choice. There were no majors. That didn't happen until later in the 20th century. Disciplines weren't as firm as they are now. So by introducing the elective system, Eliot was responsible for one of the biggest changes in American higher education in the 20th century, and really made higher education what it is today. We really can't imagine American higher ed without majors, without electives, without student choice, and programs that are entirely prescribed, where all students across the entire college, usually at the liberal arts college, are taking the same courses, are incredibly rare. So I was interested in looking into exactly why Eliot decided to really push for this change. Why was it so important to him? What made it, why was that his thing that he really wanted to see happen in his presidency? And as I was looking into the secondary literature, I didn't know what I was going to find. I didn't know his reasons. I thought, could be just because he wanted more faculty, he wanted more resources, he wanted more course offerings. I really didn't know. And so as I was looking into the secondary literature, I was a little bit surprised to discover that a lot of the authors I was reading were referencing Eliot's interest and agreement with thinkers like Herbert Spencer, who was probably the most famous, one of the most famous social Darwinist thinkers, and the social Darwinist movement in general. This was a surprise. I wasn't expecting to find something like this. And the more I looked into it, the more I noticed that authors were not obfuscating necessarily, but weren't really addressing the implications of somebody being really heavily influenced by the social Darwinist movement and being in a position of power where they can actually take that ideology and put it into practice with the thing that they're involved in, which in this case was higher education and a brand new way of doing higher ed. And so when I started to see that connection, I thought, okay, we've got something here that we should look into. And this ended up being the central theme of my capstone project. And what I argued in my capstone was that Eliot was very influenced by the social Darwinist movement, and he took a lot of the ideologies from that movement and he inputted it into the elective system. So when you think social Darwinism, the thing that probably comes to mind is survival of the fittest in society, right? And you would be correct. That is one of the central things of social Darwinism. But there are a few other things that stem from that idea, or rather begin, that are the foundation to that idea, that are important to know in moving forward. So survival of the fittest in human society means that those that are physically weak, that are not clever, that are not what we would call, that we would see as being the best, most fit, most intellectually able, those individuals in the social Darwinist worldview ought to be removed from society, either through unfortunate, nefarious means, through breeding out. And the goal is to end up with a human race that is actually perfect, that eventually evolves into being perfect. And you do that by eliminating those that are not fit. that comes from two main other tenets to the social Darwinist worldview. The first one is that human nature is mutable. Human nature is changeable. And this idea was actually incredibly revolutionary for the time. Prior to that, honestly, it was thousands of years of the same philosophy of the human state. And that was that the human condition is fixed. Our nature is fixed. We don't change. We are who we are. And that's how philosophers built political theories. That's how they built a lot of religions are based on that, is the idea that human nature is fixed. And so you know what you're getting and you know how to change, and you also know how to educate. And that's going to be important in a bit, because everybody is the same. You know how to educate because everybody ought to know the same things because everybody is the same. So social Darwinism rejected that idea and instead, really for the first time in honestly thousands of years, came up with the idea that human nature is changeable. And so for thinkers like Spencer, which I'll get to in a second, changeable as in improvable is the implication that things are getting better and better, and that if they're not getting better, we have a responsibility, or nature has a responsibility, or just does remove those that are not fit. So you've got that. Human nature is mutable. And then the other thing that may sound like we do this a lot today, or we think this way today, but that was really revolutionary for the time, was that natural phenomenon and human affairs can both be interpreted scientifically. And if they can both be interpreted scientifically, then they are indistinguishable. So the transition, and you can kind of see this when you hear survival of the fittest in human nature, that's just a callback to survival of the fittest in evolutionary biology that Darwin was putting forward. But survival of the fittest in human society is an entirely different animal, because then you end up with things like eugenics and getting rid of, removing what is perceived to be those that are not fit from human society, which is obviously a huge problem. It might be worth noting that the phrase survival of the fittest was actually coined by Herbert Spencer and not by Darwin. Darwin liked it so much that he added it back into a later edition of The Origin of Species, but it was actually a Spencerian term. So the term itself originates, and its original context was in human society and human society evolving. So those are the three basic tenets that I found through my reading of social Darwinism. Again, that's human nature is changeable, that natural phenomena and human affairs can both be assessed scientifically and are therefore indistinguishable. And third, that society, like nature, promotes the survival of the fittest. So Herbert Spencer, as a social Darwinist, agreed with all of these things. He was promoting these in some ways, and other social Darwinists were promoting these in other ways. But that's generally a Spencerian take on the social Darwinist worldview. A couple other things that are important, since my capstone in particular was arguing for Spencer's influence on Eliot and not just the social Darwinist movement in general. So for Spencer, I want to reaffirm that he agreed that human nature was mutable. But then another thing that was important to him was the move from the homogeneous to the heterogeneous. That's a tough word. From the simple to the complex. And that's viewed that's seen in evolutionary biology, going from, single cell on to more complicated beings. But for Spencer, remember, this is specifically within human society. So he's not necessarily talking about physical development or growth in physical complexity. He believed that we had kind of arrived at the physical, not saying like the human form is physical perfection necessarily. I don't know if he would say that. But the transition to greater and greater complexity was happening in the intellect. So what he believed we would see in society was greater intellectual advancement until, in fact, humanity was perfected, until we would kind of, I believe one of the authors I read used the word plateau, or maybe it was Spencer, I can't quite remember, that we would eventually plateau and we would essentially reach human perfection. And that's going to happen way down the line. So that's what that's what Spencer is looking toward, is the continual advancement, the continual growth in complexity of the human form, the human intellect, and that would eventually result in human perfection. And so it's really important for Spencer that everything, because he is promoting this idea, and because you could argue that we are now self-aware enough to know that perfection can be attained, you want to say that, then we have a responsibility to tend towards that as much as possible. So I suppose you could argue that Spencer would be pro-eugenics. In other words, we need to get rid of those who are not helping towards the advancement of the race, and we need to focus on everything that's going to help us advance the race so we can get to human perfection. Side note, he never actually specified what human perfection would actually look like, or what the mental state would be like in this plateaued perfect form, but he wanted to get there, whatever it was. And then lastly, important for us today, Spencer thought that education should be specifically geared towards this advancement. So everything that we learn from a very young age into young adulthood should all focus on how we can advance the human race and human evolution in particular. So what Eliot did was he was a very strong advocate of Spencerian thought, of Spencer's works. One of the authors I read referred to him as Spencer's greatest disciple. Eliot was called upon to write an introduction to one of Spencer's later republished editions. So once you start getting into Eliot, and once you read a little bit of Spencer, you can really see the overlap between the two, and how Eliot is pretty derived from Spencer in a lot of ways. So what Eliot did is he basically took these ideas of social Darwinism and he applied them to the educational sphere. So remember the idea that human nature is mutable? He took that and he ran with it a little bit more than you might expect. So Eliot agreed with Spencer and with other social Darwinists that human nature is mutable. And remember what I said about, if human nature is static, that means you can rely upon a certain type of education for everybody, because you can expect everybody to react in the same way or have the same failings or shortcomings or things like that. Everybody needs to learn the same things because we're all the same. Well, Eliot rejected that, and he argued that not only are we all different in that human nature is changeable, so we're all fundamentally different because we're all at different points of our evolutionary progression. We are so different, he argues, that it would actually be wrong for us to be taught the same subjects really in any similar way. Every single student is different, fundamentally, like down to our absolute core, that every student ought to learn different things that are most applicable to their specific evolutionary progressive moment, like where they are as individuals and how where they slot in on the progression towards human perfection. And so to require all students to take the same courses, whether it's at the primary schooling level, even all the way up to higher ed, is actually a significant problem, because you are forcing all students to learn things that they need not learn. And you're actually hampering human progress significantly by educating in that way. And so, and the other thing, actually, before I move on, is that Eliot was a very strong proponent of students not being equal. He did not believe in the equality of mankind, of one another, because he believed that we were all inherently different. So over and over again in his writings, he's saying, he's promoting, he says, diversity and liberty in education. So diversity meaning diversity of subjects. You learn this thing, I learn that thing, we don't learn the same thing. Diversity and liberty. So I get to choose because I know, because I'm self-aware enough to know where I am, and I want to pick something different from you. So diversity in education, liberty in education, and a strong not equality in education. So he was very much against viewing humans as equal to one another. He truly believed that some were literally better than others. And again, he would say many times that the end of education is for the advancement of democratic society, of society writ large, towards the advancement. He never came out and said like towards the advancement of human perfection the way that Spencer actually came out and said it, but it's somewhat implicit in what he's writing. So his development of the elective system viewed through this lens starts to look a little sketchy, because you have somebody who doesn't believe that all his students are equal, believes that some of them ought to be selected out. If you're not good at something, it's because you are physically incapable of becoming good at it. Like the way that you were born pretty much determines your ability in life. And if you're not very good at something, you might as well not even bother, because you're never going to be good at it. So in a very weird way, he believed in the mutability of human nature, but throughout the human race and not within individuals. So an individual is static. Like what you're born with is what you got, and you can't better yourself. You can't make yourself more intelligent. You can't work hard. You're stuck with what you got. But over the course of the entire human race, everybody's different. So it's a little strange. So viewed through this lens, the next question I had was, is the elective system, is it fraught with this type of intellectual commitment? Is it salvageable? I believe it is salvageable, and I wasn't able to get quite into the implications of it in my project. I didn't quite have the scope for that. But that's kind of the next question is, well, I don't think that the entire elective system and the way that we do higher ed is doomed just because one guy at the beginning thought this way. But it does raise a lot of questions about how we approach higher education, how we approach career choices, how we approach a lot of things, where though we certainly do not believe and agree with the social Darwinist worldview today, there's a lot of things in the social Darwinist worldview that feel alarmingly familiar. And I think it's worth taking a look at it a little bit, taking a step back, thinking about kind of how we've arrived at the current way that we view the world, and seeing if there are any problems in the way we view the world in things that feel very innocuous to us today, but might have somewhat sinister beginnings. So thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it. And I hope you learned a little something. And thanks so much. I appreciate it.